Dear team, today we are going to see about acute brain injury. Before we start, we need to have a good understanding of the anatomy of the skull, brain, and meninges. The skull is composed of multiple bones. It has an occipital bone at the back. You have a nice 3D image there. We have an occipital bone at the back. As you can see, a triangular shaped occipital bone, and in the front you have a similar larger than that a frontal bone, and in between the occipital and frontal bone you have two parietal bones, and below parietal bones you have temporal bone. So that's the basic structure of the skull. And at the base of the skull you have a hole called as foramen magnum, and foramen magnum is the hole for your spinal cord. Okay, through the foramen magnum the spinal cord comes out to your vertebrae. So that's the basic anatomy of your skull. When it comes to the anatomy of your meninges, meninges is a covering of the brain and the spinal cord as well. The meninges lies just behind, just below the skull, and it covers the brain. So it is three layers are there in the meninges. The first layer is called as dura mater. That is very durable, fibrous membrane that stick to the skull. So it's just the first layer below the skull is dura mater. As the name suggests, it's durable, very fibrous membrane, okay, to give a strength to protect the brain. And after dura mater, just below the dura mater, you have the second layer of the meninges. That's a thin spider web shaped transparent layer that is mainly all the blood vessels and things going. And then under that, you have your pia mater. Pia mater is a very delicate, just like mucous membrane, very delicate layer, and that stick to the surface of the actual brain. So between skull and the brain, you have three layered protective covering, and that is called as meninges. And meninges has three layers. First one is the dura mater. That's a fibrous layer just below the skull, and then you have your arachnoid mater. That's a thin spiderweb shaped transparent layer, and then you have your pia mater. That's a thin layer that surfaces the actual brain. So this meninges acts as a shock absorber, and it protects brain from jolt shocks when you have a deceleration, acceleration. That protects brain from injury. And also the meninges produces the cerebrospinal, not meninges, actually the choroid plexus in the ventricles produces the cerebrospinal fluid, and the CSF circulates between the arachnoid and pia mater. So that again helps to protect the brain. Okay, when it comes to the actual brain, even if you don't know the very detailed microanatomy of the brain, you just need to know the names of the lobes and the main components in the brain. As you can see, just behind your frontal bone, you have your frontal lobe, and behind your occipital bone, you have your occipital lobe, and behind your parietal bone, you have your parietal lobe, and behind your temporal lobe, you have your temporal bone. Behind the temporal bone, you have your temporal lobe, and below the occipital lobe, you have your cerebellum that is responsible for your balance and all. So I have added an image of the sagittal section. So as you can see, the brain and the cerebrum, and you can see the cerebellum, and below the occipital lobe you can see the cerebellum and the edge of the spinal cord that attached to the brain, and that's called as your midbrain, and your all the medulloblanket, everything comes there. We will learn the functions of that in a second. And you have a corpus callosum. That's like that C-shaped structure. That's a fibrous structure that connects between two cerebral hemispheres. And below that you have the lateral ventricles and your third ventricle and your fourth ventricle, where the CSF is produced, and that continues to the circulation of CSF will be continued through the meninges that covers the brain and spinal cord. So in a nutshell, it's a big anatomy. The brain is one of the most complex organ in the body, but just need to know the skull and the basic structure. So in the brain, you have your cerebrum, That cerebrum has multiple lobes. You have the occipital lobe, you have the frontal lobe, parietal lobes, and you have your temporal lobes. And other than cerebrum, you have your midbrain and you have your cerebellum as the other component. So let's see it in detail. So your brainstem, that is the part that connects the spinal cord and the brain. The end of the spinal cord is the brainstem, and that continues to the brain. So brainstem has mainly three components. One is medulla oblongata, pons varolii, midbrain. So the three components of the brainstem are medulla, pons, and midbrain. And just above the brainstem, you have your diencephalon. In the diencephalon, you have thalamo hypothalamo pituitary axis. That is you have your thalamus, you have your hypothalamus and pituitary gland, and you have your epithalamus. Pituitary, even though it situates in the brain, when we study the brain anatomy, everyone avoids that because that's an endocrine gland. So when we study endocrinology, that comes in detail. So diencephalon contains thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, plus your master gland pituitary. And then next to that, you have your cerebellum. Cerebellum is second largest portion of the brain after cerebrum, and cerebellum is responsible for your balance. And then you have your big boss, the cerebrum, the largest portion of your brain. Cerebrum has multiple lobes: the frontal, the parietal lobes, occipital lobe, and temporal lobes. Okay, the brainstem, the main function of the brainstem, that's your medulla, your pons, and your midbrain. So your brainstem connects brain to the spinal cord. Okay, the higher centers and your spinal cord. The connection between your higher centers and your spinal cord is the brainstem. And then it controls the vital functions of the body, the survival functions of the body, like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, the basic consciousness and alertness. All these vital functions of the body is controlled by your brainstem. So even after your higher senses, like your thinking, your emotions, even after your cerebrum is dead, the brainstem, if it survives, you will still breathe and your heart will still beat. Okay, then next one is the diencephalon. Diencephalon is your thalamo-hypothalamo-pituitary axis. So your thalamus participates in sensory and motor functions, and your hypothalamus participates, regulates your temperature and controls the pituitary gland, and epithalamus controls your sleep and your olfactory sense. Then below that, you have your cerebellum, just below your occipital lobe of the cerebrum. You have the second largest piece in your brain after cerebrum, that is your cerebellum. Cerebellum is responsible for balance, posture, and coordination. So if you have a couple of pegs, what's happening means your cerebellum is affected. That's why you are losing the balance. Okay, the largest portion of the brain is cerebrum. The frontal lobe is grossly responsible for emotions and motor functions. Occipital lobe is responsible for your vision. Parietal lobe responsible for your other sensory functions, and temporal lobe responsible for your memory. This is in general your anatomy and basic anatomy of your skull, your meninges, and brain. Thank you.